I was at Patrick Coburn's birthday party in Washington, D.C., and Christopher Hitchens was there. And this was long after Christopher Hitchens had made his turn to the right and been supporting the Iraq War, and also I think had called for a vote for George Bush. But I was still to some degree on speaking terms with him, and at the party he said he wanted to go out in the back garden for a smoke, and I'd actually given up smoking, but I thought, well, it'd be good to go and have a chat with Christopher. So we went out into the backyard of this Georgetown mansion, and he said, well, what are you up to now? And I said, well, we started this new publishing company and we were getting going. And he said, well, who are you publishing? And I said, well, actually, the next book that I'm publishing, the one that I'm working on at the moment, is by Norm Finkelstein. And Christopher kind of rolled his eyes and breathed his cigarette smoke out heavily. And of course, I knew that there was an issue between Norman and Hitchens because, of the war. But in a kind of innocent way, I said, is there a problem between you and Norman? And he said, he looked at me and said, well, put it like this, things took a substantial turn for the worse after he called for my murder recently on his website. So I said, well, I'm sure that he didn't mean that literally. But when I got back to New York the following day, I rang up Norman and I said, Norman, can I just ask you something? Did you call for Christopher Hitchens' murder on your website? And he said, there was a pause, and then he said, yeah, I might have done, but I took it down again.
All right, my name is Ben Burgis. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined as always by our super producer, Jake Appett, and our very talented graphic designer, J. Andrew World. And that clip was sent to me by Matt Whalen last Thursday for the Thursday night debate breakdown. Matt and Jordan and I watched Norm's 2003 debate with Alan Dershowitz. We're actually going to do a follow-up in this Thursday. We're going to watch Dershowitz versus Chomsky from a couple years after that. But yeah, Matt asked if I'd seen this clip, which I hadn't, and is certainly of interest to me for obvious reasons. Since I wrote a book about Christopher Hitchens, what he got right, how he went wrong, and why he still matters. And I actually in that book I talk a little bit about sort of battling essays between Norm and Hitchens, but I was unaware. Well, what am I doing? I should talk about Christopher Hitchens. Should do that. But I talk about these battling essays in there, but I did not know about this this call for Hitchens to be murdered, at least according to Hitchens. I should say that we have a follow-up that gives a little bit more context on that.
Yeah, the man was such a good storyteller. I forgot to take off the title script, our title image. I was really like hanging by, on his every word on that story.
All right. Do we have part two to that clip?
We sure do.
And so, I suppose that that was probably one of those kind of angry moments.
Well, it wasn't exactly like that. That was when Christopher Hitchens was grandstanding on the issue of waterboarding. He couldn't decide whether waterboarding was torture or not. And then he decided that he would have Vanity Fair sponsor a public event in which he would be waterboarded, and then he would decide on the basis of his experience whether waterboarding was torture. Well, Hitchens, hero that he is, he lasted, I think, about 4 seconds before he screamed for help and was relieved of his ordeal, and he determined it was torture. And people were really waterboarded. Some of you will be surprised to learn, because I read the U.S. Senate report on torture. One of the fellows, whose name skips my mind, he was waterboarded like 170 times. It's just kind of astonishing. So I said, well, Hitchens doesn't know whether waterboarding is torture unless he experienced it. Well, I don't know whether if you shoot 2 bullets in his skull, whether that's lethal or not. So maybe Vanity Fair can sponsor a little. I thought that was a fair point.
Yeah. In the book, I do say that, I do have some criticisms of Norm Hitchens' essay, but that I actually do think is a fair point. So, point to Norm on that one.
I guess rivalries between political folks was vicious even before Twitter, huh? Twitter didn't create calling for each other's murder, and but there still was a bit of class to that most
yeah, Twitter, you had to write out this whole thing. You probably thought about it a lot before you posted it on your website, and it's this very slow reaction, right? That it's not just like you react the next 5 seconds. It's not like the thought goes through Norm's head. 5 seconds later, Norm posts the 280 character version. 5 seconds later, Hitch, writes back. There's a process here. He writes this nicely crafted essay. He puts it on his website. Hitchens bitches about it, at Georgetown party. It's a more civilized way of doing it.
Yes, for sure.
The Dershowitz thing that we watched last Thursday was amazing. Speaking of viciousness, also before Twitter, although a lot of this played out after Twitter, but I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Twitter came out in 2004. Is that right?
I was thinking it was later, but I could be wrong.
I think it came out earlier than it made a really big impact. So I think it might be 2004. I'll Jamie. All right, I'm gonna be. Yeah. Anyway, I'll look it up as you continue.
Yeah. Pull that up.
2006.
Okay. So yeah, a lot of this is pre-Twitter. That after that debate that they had, which is the debate itself is amazing viewing. There's all this stuff in there, because Dershowitz had claimed in a previous TV appearance that if anybody could find a single factual error substantive factual error in his book, The Case for Israel, he would donate $10,000 to the PLO. And would you believe he didn't actually do it when Finkelstein found all this stuff? And so in their discussion on Democracy Now, Norm's like, well, here's a page where you say, you describe these massacres in 1948, and you say between 2,000 and 3,000 Palestinians became refugees in this phase of the war. And the source you cite actually says between 200,000 and 300,000. That seems like a significant error. And Dershowitz is like, well, either that was a typographical error and I meant 200, 300,000, or I was talking about a particular subphase of the war. And it's just kind of amazing. It's like, either you don't know. I mean, you wrote this book. That seems like how you would talk about somebody else's book.
Yeah. I'm not the type of person to make errors. So if I made an error, then just logically from my firfirst premise that I don't make errors, right? So
Obviously, it was the ghostwriter who had made the mistake, and not him. So he beat the bet.
Yeah, there you go. Possibly, fun fact, Natalie Portman, since she was actually one of the research assistants for that book.
Who?
Natalie Portman.
Oh no. Well,
to her credit, she has changed her tune on the whole subject in the years since then. She's moved substantially in the right direction since that.
No one's allowed to do that. If you said it once, that's it. That's it.
Well, do want to hit a couple other things. So I should say the episode we had planned for tonight with Jason, Jordan, and Cushbaum has been pushed back. That's going to be at the end of the month on the 28th. Just, working with everybody's schedules. So this is going to be a short and sweet episode tonight. So it's going to be, much shorter than usual, but it is going to be a lot of good stuff. The main event, I've got this debate with Brad Polumbo, pre-recorded, but we're going to show the whole thing on student debt forgiveness. People might have seen Brad arguing with Sam Cedar a while ago, or read him in places like the National Review or the New York Post. So we're going to get to that in a minute. I want to do a couple other things first, though. One of them is I want to talk about the Trump indictment, since I wrote an article in Jacobin about this, and I do want to just really quickly make a broader point here. I mean, I was talking about this on Twitter earlier today, that I think, I don't know, something I like to remind myself of, if I catch myself not doing it, is that I think it's really important to not move backwards from disagreeing with whoever annoys you the most, but instead to sort of move forward from what you care about, from socialist values, some kind of materialist analysis of the world, and sort of say, okay, what position should we take given what we care about, not how can we own the people who annoy us. And I think that this tendency to try to come up with here's how we own the people that annoy us position plays out in a lot of different ways from a lot of different directions. If the people who annoy you the most are right-wingers, you end up sounding like indistinguishable from a liberal sometimes. If the people who annoy you the most are like MSNBC brained liberals, and trust me, I get it. Objectively, those are very annoying people. When I was going to do this, I was almost thinking about asking for the video of that old SNL segment where all the women on the show sang to a portrait of Robert Mueller on the wall. That like all I want for Christmas, like that's, it was like, cause they were very excited because it was Mueller time and, the walls were closing in on Trump. And it's like, viscerally, trust me, I can't stand any of that shit at all. I think Russiagate was a hugely unhealthy obsession, etc. And if you're working backwards from being annoyed by all of that, you might end up saying, oh, actually, you might come up with some sort of contrarian hot take about why Trump being indicted is bad. And without naming any names, I've seen that. I think that's a mistake, right? Hence the title of the Jacobin article, Donald Trump being prosecuted for his crimes is good, actually. I think it is. So a lot of, and this most recent indictment in particular, actually, for conspiring to overturn the results of the election. And a lot of what I was responding to in that was this National Review article that I think we have it's called this. So it's by the editorial board of the National Review. It's called This Trump Indictment Shouldn't Stand. And so I wanted to just really quickly hit some of the big talking points that I've seen from Trump apologists about the indictment and just sort of explain why I don't think any of this is right. So from the top, we have so this is the one that I see kind of the most often. The judicial system is dangerously politicized when new administrations indict old ones. And the funny thing about this is Trumpist talking point now, but I'm old enough to remember when this was a lib talking point to excuse Obama doing the look forward, not backward thing. about CIA torture in the Bush years. And what I thought then, and I still think now, and not to put too fine a point on it, some of the people who convinced me of it then no longer see it this way, but I still do, is that this is exactly backwards. Obviously, I'm not saying that there's ever been a apolitical judicial system, or there ever could be. It's never ideologically neutral, but I think the actually dangerous way that politics can intrude into the judicial system is when presidents and ex-presidents and other powerful people are treated as like special people who are above the law, and they're not prosecuted for things that the rest of us would be. So let's just run through these. The second one, got none of the Obama or Biden scandals have generated indictments, but Trump is racking them up. Must be partisan bias. To which I would say, we all remember when Ronald Reagan was criminally prosecuted over Iran-Contra and the CIA's drug running in the 1980s. I don't know when Reagan was let out of prison, but must have been quite a while after that. And of course, as we all know, George W. Bush is serving several consecutive life sentences for starting an illegal war based on falsified evidence and setting up black sites all around the world to torture people, and etc. I think there is a double standard. It's not that one. We're going to get to it, but let's keep going. He's being indicted for exercising his free speech rights. No, he is not. If you actually read or even glance at the indictment, you'll see there's a pretty clear distinction being made here. That the kind of thing that he's being prosecuted for, is when they talk about conspiring to overturn the election, is not giving speeches. It's not even filing frivolous lawsuits or anything like that. It's trying to do things like suborn fake slates of fake electors and get states to substitute them for the real ones, and urge these guys to like sign false affidavits certifying that he'd really won the election. Which, it strikes me that if any of us were involved in like a case about like a stolen car, and we were getting witnesses to sign knowingly false statements about what had happened there, we would be facing serious legal trouble. I think that if you're doing the same thing for taking away millions of people's voting rights by trying to overturn the result of the election, that does seem like the kind of thing the courts should take an interest in. Continuing. It's a statue from the Civil War that's being misused. This one I find particularly funny. It is a statue, well, not from the Civil War, but from Reconstruction, from after the Civil War. That was the intention, was to basically stop people, stop ex-Confederates from stopping black people in the South from being able to vote. But basically what the statute says is, hey, you can't conspire to deny people their right to a fair election. And that the shoe would seem to fit. In fact, most conservatives are textualists about the law anyway. They take the position that what matters is the actual words of the text and how everybody would have understood those words, not what the lawmakers' intentions were. If there's an unintended consequence, Congress can always pass a new law to get rid of it. But I think that one doesn't really hold any water either. If the president does something wrong, constitutional remedy is impeachment. They make a big deal of this in the Civil War one in the National Review article, which is just awesome, right? So it suggests that the absolute most that should ever happen to any president who breaks any law is that they should be removed from office, which means, I suppose, that if you break any laws after you leave office, then whatever, doesn't matter. It's like, you made it to home base, so you can't be out anymore. That seems like a really bad way to run a legal system. And of course, look, I'm not particularly attached to the Constitution that was written by bankers and slaveholders anyway. I think we could do better. The Socialist Republic of the future, we could have a better one. But also, there's absolutely nothing in the Constitution that says presidents can't be prosecuted criminally for breaking laws in office. And I think we have one more. What about Bush, I think, is by far the best one. So Sohrab Ahmari wrote an article where he basically ran this one. And yeah, look, I get it, right? Like, this gets us to the real double standard, which is not at all the partisan one, right? It's not about Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives. It's about crimes committed in other countries that we don't think matter, especially, crimes committed against, scary sounding Muslims. I think for Obama, I talk in the article about his assassination through drone strikes of Anwar al-Awlaki, who was actually an American citizen. He was a radical imam. He was certainly pro-terrorist, but it seems like there's a fair amount of evidence that what he was being extrajudicially executed for, which is what we're essentially talking about, the extrajudicial execution of an American citizen, wasn't really anything that he'd done. That one actually was his speech, right? That he'd like those sort of fiery sermons he would give. And also his 16-year-old son, Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, who's, of course, also an American citizen. That's the sort of thing that I think that, yes, it would be wonderful if Obama were indicted for that. And certainly Bush for, again, illegally invading Iraq and violation of certainly what it says about war powers in the U.S. Constitution and as well as the UN Charter, which the U.S. is a signatory to, and starting this worldwide network of black sites where people who had never been convicted of anything could be detained and tortured, etc. Absolutely, it's galling that Bush did things that were much worse than what Trump has been accused of, and he not only has he not been indicted for it, but of course he, there are charming moments like this one. We have the Bush clip. We've shown this before, but just as a reminder.
In contrast, Russian elections are rigged. Political opponents are imprisoned or otherwise eliminated from participating in the electoral process. The result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine. Iraq, too. Anyway. 75.
Yeah, that's pretty galling, guys. Not only not in prison where he belongs, but is out there, like, if he, Bush, Grandpa Bush is getting up there in years. Every once in a while, he remembers all of his war crimes and accidentally admits to them in public and gets this round of warm and forgiving laughter from the assembled ghouls. That is maddening, but I would suggest that double standard, the real double standard about crimes of empire versus conspiring to overturn an American election, is galling. But just because you've identified a double standard, you've identified an inconsistency, that doesn't tell you how to resolve it yet. We still have the separate question about, okay, what's the direction we want that double standard to be resolved in? And I don't want it to be the number of former presidents who've been held accountable for some of their crimes should go from 1 to 0. Ideally, I would like all of these guys to be indicted.
Absolutely. It's frustrating because, I remember growing up and people were still talking about Nixon when I was a kid and about how it was a good thing to have forgiven his sins. And it's like, no,
it wasn't.
Honestly, in hindsight, it's worse. It's made things worse. Like we don't indict because of Nixon.
No, absolutely. I think the Nixon pardon really set the precedent that of intra-elite forgiveness for whatever a president does in office, and that's been absolutely devastating. Okay, I did have one other thing, but I think I want to save it for maybe the end of the main show, maybe the post game. I want to get to the debate with Brad Polumbo. So we're going to have to screen share this. So yeah, I think we've got it started. They're going to explain who everybody is. They're going to explain what we're talking about. So I don't think we need any more intro from me. Let's just go straight to it.
The topic for our first episode is, should the government cancel student loan debt? And today's speakers will be Ben Burgis and Brad Polumbo. Ben Burgis is a columnist for Jacobin, a left-wing magazine that offers socialist perspectives on politics, economics, and culture. Ben is also an adjunct philosophy professor and the host of the podcast and YouTube show Give Them an Argument. He's been on the Joe Rogan Experience, Debate Night with Charlie Kirk, The Majority Report, and The Young Turks. Our second speaker is Brad Polumbo. Brad is a libertarian conservative journalist and the co-founder of Base Politics. Brad has appeared on Fox News and Fox Business and has written for publications such as USA Today, The National Review, Newsweek, and The Daily Beast. He is also the host of the Breaking Boundaries podcast. Brad will kick us off in this discussion about student loan debt. So Brad, whenever you're ready, please take it away.
The biggest problem with the push to cancel student debt, which really means make taxpayers absorb the financial loss for it, is that it rests on a false assumption that we're in a student debt crisis. But while college is much too expensive and people have a lot in student loans, we're actually not living through a student loan crisis in any meaningful sense of the word. We've all been inundated with horror stories about people buried in hundreds of thousands of debt they can't pay off, but those stories are very much the exception, not the norm. They just receive disproportionate media coverage because many people on the media, they seize on those stories to push an agenda, student debt relief, which is something they support for ideological and partisan reasons. But when you actually look at the numbers, it's really not clear that there is a student debt crisis at all. Yes, Americans owe about $1.8 trillion in student debt, most of which is held by the federal government, aka federal taxpayers, but big numbers alone don't constitute a crisis. After all, Americans also owe $1.5 trillion in auto loan debt, but nobody really calls that a crisis. And of course, Americans owe $11.4 trillion in total mortgage debt, more than 6 times as much as student loans. And of course, nobody walks around and says that we're living through a mortgage debt crisis. It is very much only in student loans where a large amount of debt is intrinsically viewed as a crisis, even though for most people, the payments are actually pretty affordable. So the average monthly student loan payment under typical conditions, looking at a standard 10-year plan with 4% interests, is about $287 a month, according to the Cato Institute. And because the average recipient of a bachelor's degree earns $1.2 million more over their lifetime and has a starting salary on average of $55,000, that's a pain, but it's not a crisis. In fact, it only would account for about 6% of a graduate's salary. So how are we to ask taxpayers to take on an enormous burden, absorb over $1.5 trillion in financial burden, all in response to a crisis that's overhyped and exaggerated? And in fact, the people pushing this want taxpayers to spend trillions of dollars to help a slice of society that's relatively affluent. It seems like everybody goes to college these days, but it's really only still a small slice of the public that actually has a bachelor's degree. And by and large, they're the ones who benefit from student debt relief. But they're also the ones who make more money than everyone else. That's why people go to college, which is why a University of Chicago study found that 6 times more benefit goes to the top 20% than the bottom 20% from complete student debt cancellation. This isn't a much needed response to a crisis. It's welfare for the affluent at the working taxpayer's expense.
Thanks, Brad. Up next, we'll have Ben, who will start with his intro, and then he'll go into his first line of questions for Brad.
I'm not actually especially interested in whether student loan debt counts as a crisis. I'm interested in whether student debt is a combination of words that would exist in a civilized society. And I think the answer is no. Imagine that we lived in a society where every now and again the high priests read something particularly worrying in goat entrails and thought the gods were displeased, so they arranged human sacrifice on the White House lawn. Since I'm A, an atheist, and B, not a supporter of the death penalty, I would be against that. But I wouldn't really care whether enough people were being sacrificed on the White House lawn to count as a full-blown crisis. If it was one guy every 2 years, there was absolutely nothing compared to other forms of death by violence, I'd still want the president to issue an executive order enjoining the high priests against going onto the White House lawn and doing sacrifices. Now, making people go into debt to pay for a college education is nowhere near as bad as human sacrifice. But the real question is, should it be a thing that happens in the first place? If not, and I don't think so, then it's obviously wrong to continue to shake people down for payments. If a mob protection racket extorted payments from shopkeepers, and some of them were behind on their payments while others were current, no reasonable person would say that shutting down the protection rackets, that no one owed further payments, would be unfair to those who'd already paid everything they owed, or unfair to people who didn't have shops at all and so weren't affected by this. My view is that public education should be tuition free from preschool to graduate school. No one should be charged for it in the first place, and as such, no one should be hounded for payments for it after the fact. Right-wing critics of even the relatively limited and miserly student debt cancellation attempted by the Biden administration and recently overturned in a pretty astonishing act of conservative judicial activism by the Supreme Court will often describe it as if cancellation were a cash transfer to the beneficiaries of cancellation. But we should note that this is in consistency with the way they themselves would normally talk about debts owed to the federal government. When Republican politicians pass tax cuts, canceling some of what would otherwise be owed by upper income Americans in the future, I never hear conservatives or Republicans describing this money as money that's being paid to those upper income Americans by the federal government, even though, at least on the surface, it seems like the same reason would apply. Less money will be coming in that has to be made up for somehow, with cuts, with more debt, or by taking it from somewhere else. And so it seems to me, if we're going to describe one asking for less money to come in the future as a transfer to the people that you're not going to ask for the money to come in from, uniform standards would be nice. Now, I think by far the strongest point Brad made is that a minority of Americans go to college. I'm cautiously optimistic that it would be a larger percentage if college were tuition free and no one worried that they'd have to go into debt in the first place to pay for it. Even so, I'd want universal student debt cancellation paired with, for example, universal medical debt cancellation, which could be justified by reasoning that is would be exactly similar, certainly on my part, which would benefit a far wider swath of the population. And if the concern is that canceling student debt means that people who have more are paying less to the federal government, there is a solution to that, which is called taxes. If your goal is to get people who have more to pay for the federal government, you can just do that directly by raising taxes on an upper income bracket rather than going through this extremely imperfect proxy of student loan debt, where even though most beneficiaries are on the upper end of the income distribution, there's absolutely no guarantee that's always the case. And in fact, the debt lies hardest on those minority of beneficiaries who are not. My question for Brad, though, would be this. Does he agree that K-12 education should be tuition free? And if so, what's the difference? And if he thinks it should be tuition free, I would love to have him enter into a little hypothetical for me. Imagine that it wasn't. Would you support cancellation of high school student loan debt if public high schools were not tuition free? And if not, why not?
So I want to respond to a couple points, and then I'll dive into that specific question. But one, the question of should student debt exist? I would say yes, frankly, it should. I mean, what we're talking about is a degree in education that will earn you $1 million or more over your lifetime. And if you're going to end up being $20,000 to $30,000 in debt, which is around the average for a graduate in 2021, yeah, I think that's a fair trade-off to ask you to make when you're going to make over $1 million more on average in your lifetime, to have some skin in the game and maybe take a little bit of debt and pay a few $100s a month. I don't find that unreasonable at all. And what I do find unreasonable is the proposition that it wouldn't exist, which means taxpayers would be paying for it, because nothing is free. Resources can never be conjured out of thin air. Everything must come from somewhere else. And so what you're really saying, if you say student debt shouldn't exist, is that I have a right to pursue my higher education, to go study, to go live my life on campus, and make Bob down the street pay for it, make the trucker down the street pay for it, make the person who already went to college and paid it their own way pay for it. And I don't think adults have the right to subsist off of others when they're fully able-bodied and capable of taking care of themselves. I think it is right and moral to ask them to pay their own way and have skin in the game on an investment that's going to radically improve their economic prospects. The primary benefits are to them. And so, yeah, I think it's totally fine to have some degree of student debt, although I do think college could be much less expensive than it is through a variety of reforms. That's kind of a separate issue. Now, onto the question, I would say I do largely believe that access to K through 12 education should be available regardless of a family's means. Ideally, I would probably have richer families have to pay for it themselves. But sure, yes, it should be available through K-12 to anybody. I favor school choice, a Milton Friedman-esque voucher system. But I do think poor families should have some form of tuition support from taxpayers, because I do want every child to have an opportunity. But that's the difference. We're talking about children, not adults. That is a dividing line we draw in society for a reason. And we expect adults to take care of themselves and not to subsist off of others. And yes, obviously children are not ready to take care of themselves. That's why they're considered children. So for me, that's the most fundamental distinction between K-12 and higher education. But then the flip side is also that you kind of need at least a basic education, right? Reading and writing and a high school diploma to function as an adult in society. You don't need a bachelor's degree. 2 in 3 Americans over age 25 don't have one. It is more common, and a lot of paths to success do require one, but plenty don't. And the majority of adult Americans don't have a bachelor's degree. So while it's become a lot more common, it's still something extra. It's not a basic prerequisite of existing in America in the same way that a high school diploma really is. So those are the main reasons why I don't think there's anything inconsistent about believing in some degree of income-based support for K-12 education for children, and yet expecting adults to pay their own way and take on skin in the game for their own investments that will improve their lifetime earnings when it comes to higher education. That's the reason we call it higher education, after all. It is extra, it is additional, it is beyond the basic. And I think it is more than fair to ask people to pick up that tab for themselves rather than to essentially mooch off their neighbors and force them to pick up the tab for their own personal advancement.
So I wanted to note a couple things about that answer. First, if you listen closely, and Brad, please do correct me if I'm getting into this wrong, but what it sounded like to me is that Brad isn't actually saying that K-12 public education should be free the way that it is right now. In fact, I wasn't entirely clear on whether he thinks there should be such a thing as public education per se. It sounds like he wants either public schools that charge tuition to anyone who can't prove that they can't afford it, or who's above, a certain income threshold, or maybe that we should only have private schools, but we should have income support in the form of means-tested public vouchers for those private schools. And that definitely changes the shape of the discussion if that is his position. So I'd be very curious if I'm getting that right. And if that is right, I do think this cuts to the heart of our larger philosophical disagreement. I don't think that adults benefiting from a variety of public services that everybody pays through progressive taxation amounts, in his phrase, to adults mooching from their neighbors. If Brad's house is on fire and a taxpayer-funded public fire department comes in to put it out, I don't think he is therefore mooching off of his neighbors. If he checks a book out of a public library or takes his dog on a walk in a public park, I don't think that Brad is mooching off of his neighbors. I don't think he's mooching off of all the other taxpayers who, like him, have to kick in a share toward all those things. And so my very simple follow-up question would be, given the way he laid it out before, that, okay, children is one thing, but adults shouldn't benefit from this kind of taxpayer help, would he disagree with me about those examples? Does he think that public services in general, public parks, public libraries, public fire departments, public police departments, etc., are all instances in which the beneficiaries are mooching off of their neighbors?
Yeah, so in response to that question, look, I'm certainly not out here railing to defund the fire department, but I think it gets to a question of what we think the proper scope of government is. And for me, I believe in a limited government that largely exists to protect the life, liberty, and property of its citizens. So a fire department protects your physical safety and your property. It is not, pursuing a degree in gender studies. I think they're pretty different things. Also, because the benefits of, basically everybody's house is about equally likely to burn down, I would say. I guess that gets into some niche construction questions that maybe I'm not informed upon, but that's just a common thing that faces all members of society. However, you getting a degree that will increase your lifetime earnings $1 million or more over your lifetime, that's a you thing. That's not an all of society thing. And I don't think it's I do think it's mooching to make your neighbors pay for that. I mean, just imagine, it's all free, it's all taxpayer funded. I could go study my bachelor's degree, I can go get my PhD in poetry. It doesn't matter if it has any social utility at all. I can just live the college life with my friends and bury my nose in the books and subsist at everyone else's expense while they work. I think that is an immoral, I think it's an unjust way to organize society, to essentially shackle onto others the financial burden of enabling somebody else's extended adolescence. I just completely reject it. I think a limited government to protect our rights, liberty, and safety is one thing, right? We come together to fund a fire department, but it's a whole nother to say that you have a right to force other people to pay for your college degree, to increase your lifetime earnings, and then to enable you to have, in many times in many college campuses these days, essentially just have a multiple year-long adolescence, partying, drinking, sleeping through classes. I mean, I went to a public college, and I'll tell you, a lot of it's a joke. A lot of modern higher education has very little redeeming intellectual value, very little actual practical usefulness outside of certain sectors like STEM or tech. It's really become, and there's a great book about this by Brian Kaplan, but it's really become a sorting mechanism rather than something that actually increases your intellect or productivity or skills. But so no, I don't find it at all compelling that should be socialized in the same way that a highway or a fire department or police or a military are. And also there's not a free rider problem in the same way, because the fundamental reason to finance something like a fire department or a military through taxation is because of the free rider problem. If it was all just voluntarily funded, individuals would have an incentive to free ride and it wouldn't get adequately funded overall. That's not really the case with higher education, because so much of the benefit is primarily onto you, the individual who gets the degree. So you will pay for it if it is meaningful to you. And so I just think it is a totally different comparison. And so that's how I feel about that. But I have some questions for Ben, and one of which is that I know, and I don't mean this pejoratively, but I know you're a progressive. I think you would call yourself a socialist, at least you write for Jacobin. And so is it not strange to find yourself in the position where you're advocating a government intervention, a government spending redistribution program that basically all people, all serious policy analysts, from the Urban Institute to the Brookings Institute to the Cato Institute to the Heritage Foundation to the CBO, all agree is regressive? It is not progressive. The benefits primarily flow to the upper slices of income distribution and very small benefits to the poor and working class. I mean, this is not, it's just a question of who holds student debt. Like I said, I can show you the Chicago study that 6 times more benefit goes to the top 20% of earners than the bottom 20%. But basically every analysis finds some degree of regressive benefits from this policy, from the Urban Institute, from Brookings, from these center-left sources that actually still support it. But my question is this: is it not strange for you to find yourself in the position where, as a progressive, you are advocating for a policy that is objectively regressive in its benefits and outcomes?
No, it doesn't bother me for a couple of reasons. First, I think that while true, the point that it disproportionately benefits higher income earners is misleadingly incomplete. People from disadvantaged backgrounds who take out student loan debt are more likely to owe lots of debt much later on than people who come from better off backgrounds. That's why Black graduates, for example, are so much more likely statistically than white graduates to owe more student loan debt. It's not somehow built into the melanin. That's about economics. Second, if the democratic socialist agenda that I want were enacted, including full cancellation of all student loan debt, no one could seriously argue that the package would be net regressive. I want tuition-free higher education paid for with progressive income taxes, and hence making the people Brad says he's worried about benefiting pay more. I also want all sorts of other things paid for by progressive taxation because we have a fundamental disagreement on the proper role of the state. And trust me, the net effect will not be regressive. On that larger disagreement, I want to just remind everyone that I asked Brad, given that he says some degree of financial support is fine, K-12, but not for adults, since adults should mooch off their neighbors, what he thinks of a variety of relatively uncontroversial public services like fire departments and public parks and public libraries. He answered the part about fire departments by saying that part of the function of government for him is to protect life, and putting out fires keeps people alive. Now, I cannot resist taking just a moment here that I'm delighted to hear Comrade Brad is now implicitly on board with Medicare for All, which also keeps people alive. But I'll also note that we never heard about public parks and public libraries, for which there's no protected life and liberty justification, but which are part of how a reasonable society secures a better, richer life for everyone, which, to my mind, also includes giving everybody who wants to spend the first few years of their adulthood reading and thinking and developing their mind and trying to figure out what to do with their life a chance to do that. When Brad talks about what college is like beyond gesturing at, drinking and partying and this kind of Animal House description that describes some people's college experience far more than others and honestly describes the totality of almost no one's, Brad wants to talk about BAs in gender studies. He wants to talk about PhDs in poetry. But I just want to note the double standard. He doesn't think it matters that some people struggle for decades to pay awful student debt burdens. He doesn't think it matters that worse off graduates are hurt disproportionately by student debt, because all that matters is the average. All that matters is what's the average income of people who went to college and people who hold student debt. Somehow, though, when he wants to portray college as fundamentally frivolous, he doesn't want to talk about the average. He doesn't want to talk about the most popular majors like business, health, engineering, or computer science. He wants to talk about stuff that's actually quite unpopular, that's actually quite unaverage, and I'm not sure why.
So the reason I was focused in those examples on poetry or gender studies is because it's not the computer science majors who are having trouble paying off their student loan debt. I can assure you that. And the fundamental problem with having people come in and have taxpayers absorb all the costs, regardless of what people study, is you're removing the incentive that pushes people to study the things that have higher after graduation incomes, like computer science degrees or business degrees, as opposed to political science or poetry or philosophy or these other degrees that really have abysmal post-graduation outcomes and very low starting salaries on average, which is all information people have available and know going into the college selection process and as they're choosing a major. And so fundamentally, I don't want to reward decisions that are not productive and wouldn't be productive for an individual to choose on their own if they had to weigh all the costs and benefits, but might be something they choose when the costs are passed on to other people and whatever benefits there are still mostly given to them. So that's why I've focused on those examples. But just to fundamentally just push back on the idea that It is not the case that what is happening on most college campuses is just rigorous intellectual development. I really don't think that's true. In fact, there's a lot of studies showing, in books, there's an entire book written about this, The Case Against Education by Brian Kaplan, showing that huge swaths of college students, if you test them before and after on things like critical thinking and reading comprehension, show no difference if you test them before college and then 5 years after. And so I really do question the value of a lot of what passes as higher education today. And if people are actually on the hook for the costs and benefits, then they can choose things that I don't see value in, but I shouldn't be forced to subsidize their extended adolescence. Which kind of brings me to my next question for Ben. Somebody like me, right? I went to an affordable public in-state college for 3 years, where I took credit overloads to save money. I worked nights as a security guard from a week before my freshman year even started. I went out of my way to do everything I could to graduate without student debt. And now you're suggesting that I should pay more over the rest of my lifetime in taxes or be on the hook for more government debt, which obviously has economic consequences, because other people made different decisions. Millions of Americans like me feel like that screws us over, feel like that's fundamentally unfair. What's your response to us? Because I think that's a valid frustration. Millions and millions of Americans feel that people who hold your position should have to grapple with.
The first point I would make is that it's a bit misleading to ask what I'd say to the millions of Americans who don't think it was fair of Biden to try to cancel at least some student debt, when we actually have polling data on this and far more support it than oppose it. There isn't an outright majority one way or the other, since there are lots of undecideds. Hi there, undecideds. But at least according to the Ipsos USA Today poll I saw, 47% of Americans support Biden's student debt cancellation plan. Only 41% are opposed to it. Now, to be fair, only about a third of Americans would go as far as I would and support wiping out all student debt. Every penny is a matter of principle. Since education is a basic good everyone should have as a right, free of the point of service and paid for by everybody to the extent that they could afford it through progressive taxation, just like public parks and public libraries and Medicare and Medicaid, which I would also like to be simplified to just Medicare for all. But an equally fair question for me to ask back to Brad would be, what would he say to the large plurality of Americans who supported the president's plan, who wanted this to happen, who didn't think it was fair to continue to shake people down for student debt payments, and didn't want the Supreme Court to sweep in and impose its political preferences above their political preferences by coming up with this sort of strange Jesuitical justification about what counts as waiving and what counts as adjusting in order to stop the president from exercising power that the letter of the law pretty clearly, it seems to me, gives him. Okay, you could say, but putting all that aside, even after we've appropriately removed the framing about millions of people and reminded ourselves of the existence of the more millions of people who have the other position, what would I say to people who did what Brad did, who who went to all these efforts to make sure that they wouldn't have to pay off debt in the first place, or people who maybe didn't do quite what Brad did, but at least managed to get all of their debt paid off in the first place? What I would say is that they never should have had to do that. They never should have had to worry about that. I think everyone, whether they come from a rich family or a middle class one or a poor one, has an equal right to enjoy and benefit from a basic human good like getting an education without worrying about how they're going to pay it off in the first place. Societies like some of the Nordics today, or for that matter, California back when the UC system was free, or New York back when CUNY was free, that provide this for everyone, are doing a far better job of approximating justice, of approximating some kind of basic equality in the life that everybody can expect regardless of their background than we are. And I would like us to take a baby step in that direction by no longer hounding anybody. And yes, it does include some computer engineering majors as well as gender studies majors, but not hounding anybody for a debt for something that they should have never been charged for in the first place, and instead simply paying for education through progressive taxation. So instead of just saying, oh, well, people who graduated from college are more likely to have more money and be able to afford to do this, we can just charge people through taxes according to how much money they actually have in any given case.
Okay, everyone, we're going to move into the discussion section now. In Ben's last response, he mentioned a question to you, Brad, which was, what do you say to the large plurality of people who did support President Biden's plan to cancel student loan debt? So I think, Brad, we could start there for the discussion. Maybe you can answer his question directly.
So as for what I would say to the millions of Americans who do support student debt cancellation, well, first I'd say they're wrong because polls don't actually tell you whether something is right or wrong. But also I would point out that once you explain to people, once you present them with the costs and benefits of student debt cancellation, it quickly is no longer a majority position. So if you ask people, do you support canceling $10,000 in student loan debt for people under X income? The Cato Institute did really interesting polling, and you get a majority saying yes. Then you ask them the same question, but say, do you support this if it means higher taxes? Support plummets. Do you support this if it means universities will jack up tuition prices in response? Support plummets. Do you support this if it means that there will be degree inflation and more jobs will require bachelor's degrees? Support plummets. So like most things, the public policy polling is a lot more complicated. I guess I just say, if you feel entitled to this, I think you should pay your own bills. I think you're an adult. I think that my fundamental principle and belief is that adults should pay their own way in life and pay for the things that are going to, and we can talk about extreme cases of disability or deprivation, but generally speaking, I mean, you're going to make $1 million more from something. You should pay for it yourself.
Yeah, I mean, the reason that I brought up the polling is that you asked me not just what would I say to you, right? But to all the millions of people who said the same thing. And then I think it actually does become relevant that millions more would say.
But there's still millions who disagree with it, even if it's a minority of the polls. That's still millions of Americans.
Sure, but not as many millions as who take the contrary position. And I certainly don't find it particularly informative that, like every single other policy that has ever been proposed by anybody, support always goes down when you package the question together with the talking points of one side of that policy debate, but not the responses from people on the other end. I find that extremely uninteresting. What I find much more interesting is what you said about how you think that adults should pay their own way, which we established doesn't mean that you think that adults should just be having to pay for private fire insurance or private security instead of police departments. Still not totally clear what it means about stuff like public parks and public libraries. But I mean, I think that the sort of more general issue is, why is it that we should have this extraordinarily limited and anemic conception of what government does, far less than what I think even most mainstream conservatives would say that it should. I mean, like, why is it? What's the moral
because
case?
Government is bloated, it's inefficient, it constantly creeps in its mission and its power, and government, it can be oppressive if it grows large. I think that's something progressives would agree with, and I don't want a government that controls economy and people's livelihoods. That when you separate there's a reason economic freedom and political freedom closely correspond. That's because it's a lot easier to repress people when you control their livelihoods. And so this expansive vision of government that progressives like yourself support, where it is so heavily in control, it's like, I acknowledge that private sector actors are motivated by greed and self-interest. However, I think Government actors are also motivated by greed and self-interest, whereas the entire progressive economic philosophy rests on this notion that they're going to act in the public interest. And I think basically every historical example shows that that's not true, that they have their own agenda that they're working to pursue, and that the government should be kept incredibly limited because it's not going to work in the interest of the people, of the working class. The spending is going to be lobbied for and go to whoever's got the biggest corporate lobbying budget. It's not going to be the people who rise up and benefit from all these expansions of government power. It never is. So Ben, can I just ask you, let's be real about taxation.
Go
ahead.
Ask what you'd like, but I do want to respond to that.
Sure. Why don't you do that first?
Okay, sure. Yeah. So I think that there's an important equivocation here about size of government. That whether we're talking about the size of services provided by government, so in that sense of size, a means-tested government program is smaller than a universal one, or a conception of size in terms of power held by government over people. And I would argue that very often those two actually point in opposite directions. If you have means testing, then you've increased government bureaucracy because you now are empowering gatekeepers to decide who qualifies for something and who doesn't, and putting people at their mercy, as opposed to if something is like K-12 public education, that you just show up and get it. You have a right to it as a citizen. And I actually do think that in places where we do have things like free universal health care or free universal public higher education, like some of the Nordic countries that I mentioned before, I do think that unambiguously works better for the working class. I'm all in favor of economic freedom, but I do think we'd mean fundamentally different things by it. Real quick point before I throw it back to you, just this, I want to say that whenever you say people, something is charged for at the point of service, it's not provided as a universal right, you're decreasing people's freedom relative to the private employers who boss them around at the workplaces where they spend half their lives, because now, oh shit, if I piss off my boss and I get fired, now I have to worry about health insurance. Now I have to worry, how am I going to pay my kids' college tuition? And those are all strings of power over people that are cut when we make these things universal.
So you mentioned the Nordic countries. So are you willing to admit then that you want most working and middle class people to pay 50 to 60% taxes?
I think that higher taxes can't be discussed in isolation. I think that you have to look at the overall package that you're getting. So
that's a yes. You want 50 to 60% tax rates like they have in Nordic countries.
I think it's a silly framing to say, like, what do I think the specific percentage should be?
I'm asking about the trade-offs, the costs, because you can't just have it all by taxing the billionaires. You admit that, right?
Yes, I absolutely agree with that, which is why I said that the trade-off that I'm interested in is what extra people at any given income level are paying, and then what they're getting back in return. I think you'll find again that it would be very unpopular in all of those places if you like. There is a reason why even conservative parties in places like Sweden and Denmark and Norway and Finland don't campaign for office on the program. We're going to privatize healthcare. We're going to end tuition-free public college, etc. But don't worry, you'll pay lower taxes, because I think most people correctly, having experienced that, correctly see that is a really good deal overall.
I think it's just because the Overton window has been radically shifted and those things have been normalized, and there's an extensive status quo bias. And then nobody wants to be the one politically to take things away or to be the adult in the room. But I guess I just don't understand why you feel entitled to forcibly confiscate. Because when we're talking about taxation, we're ultimately talking about, at the point of a gun, forcing somebody to turn over their property. How you feel so entitled to redistribute and seize from people so much of their hard-worked, hard-earned income. I mean, we're talking 50, 60% tax rates is what is faced in exchange for the services that you want to give to people. But that's not a voluntary bargain. That's confiscating people's wealth and giving it to other people at the point of a gun. I just don't understand how you can feel entitled to so much of someone else's property through force?
Yeah, so what I would recommend, since I know we're coming up to the limit of the time and I want to keep this answer as brief as possible, is that people read an essay by Matt Brunig called Non-Aggression Never Does Any Argumentative Work at Any Time. And the core point that he makes there is that when you use this rhetoric about confiscating stuff, the point of a gun, force, violence, this is always a red herring, because any distribution of scarce resources, anytime you say person A should get this in person, rather than person B, that's always going to be enforced by some kind of implicit, system of force. Whether we're talking about a letter from the IRS is one kind of implicit threat of force, and no trespass inside is another kind of threat of force. The force is exactly the same. In fact, when people do have these principles about, confiscation is bad, force is bad, whatever, they'll always say, well, confiscation of legitimate property, but the legitimate is always where 100% of the action is, because the question is always what distribution of property is legitimate, and that's always a question about broader principles about justice.
All right, thank you both for a great discussion here. As we wrap up, I'll now pass it to Brad, who will share his last word first, and then Ben, you're up second.
All right. Well, I have really enjoyed this conversation. Big thanks to Ben for engaging. It's always great, and unfortunately too rare to find people on opposite sides of the issues who are willing to talk it out in a civil, if passionate manner. And so I've really enjoyed this. But just to close things out here, if I'd leave folks with a couple things, it's one, be wary of the rhetoric around a student debt crisis. Crisis is a dangerous word, used often by people who are trying to convince the public to go along with something they otherwise might not. If you look at 9/11 and the Patriot Act, if you look at the coronavirus and the expansions of government power, crises, real and exaggerated, are always used to usher in expanded government power and confiscate more of your property and your liberties. And I'm afraid that this rhetoric about a student debt crisis is no exception. It's wildly exaggerated. There are some people that are struggling, but for most people, payments are pretty manageable. And it's just fundamentally unfair to ask working class taxpayers to pick up the bill for other people's education that will earn them millions of dollars more over their lifetime. It's a deeply regressive policy to force taxpayers to pick up this bill, with 6 times more benefit going to the top 20% of income earners than the bottom 20% of income earners. It is just fundamentally regressive. It's not a moral way to redistribute wealth, and it doesn't actually solve the problem of college affordability, which absolutely is out of control, but a bunch of solutions for that require a different conversation for a different day. But there's no such thing as free, and this policy is extraordinarily expensive, and it benefits the people who are doing well at the expense of the working class. So it is not the bill of goods it's been sold to you as. And remember to be critical of the messaging that you hear parroted throughout the mainstream media about this subject that makes it sound like it's a free lunch.
Thank you so much, Brad. This was a fun discussion, and I really hope it's not the last one that you and I have. The fundamental point that I want to close by circling and underlining is just this. I don't want a society where for some people, there's never the slightest question about whether they should go to college if they want to. There's never the slightest question about whether they can have this period in their lives of learning, of exploration, figuring things out. And for others, it's a massively fraught decision. Do I want to have to go into debt? Is there a way to avoid it? Will I be able to afford it? What happens if I chase some trend, and what major is linked to lots of jobs that have been coming available in the last few years, but then I'm caught flat-footed, as has happened again and again and again in the past when the economy changes and the jobs change and my degree becomes worthless. Maybe I should just go straight into the workforce. Maybe that's the sensible thing to do. And even though I only have one life to live and I'm never going to get this chance again, I should just do the sensible thing. That's a fundamentally unfair way for society to be structured in a way that's captured by, for example, the veil of ignorance thought experiment from the political philosopher John Rawls. He asked people to imagine what society they would design if they didn't know, for example, whether they were going to be born in a high-income family where paying college tuition would be no problem, or in a family where they had to worry about all of these things. If you don't know what kind of family background you're born into, would you want some people to have to go into debt? They'd have years of anxiety about paying off, even if everything went ideally well. Or would you want it to be paid for the same way we pay for K-12 public schools, for fire departments, for parks, for libraries, for healthcare in many countries? And if I had my way in this one, is a basic universal good paid for by everyone through universal taxation. I agree that it's bad for policies to shift debt burdens to the federal government in regressive ways. That's why I don't support stopping at student debt cancellation. I support packaging it together with tuition-free public education, public higher education, and healthcare, and any number of other programs. And for anyone who's watching, whose big concern is that the end result of this will be that higher income people will not end up paying more, trust me, you don't need to worry about that.
Thanks to everyone who tuned in for the first episode of the Dialogue Show, and big thank you again to Ben Burgis and Brad Polumbo. We'll be back soon with episode 2, and as mentioned at the beginning of the show, if you too care about helping people understand the world and you want to get involved with Dialogue, please head to www.dialogue.so and connect with our team. Thanks.
All right, it's the Brad Polumbo debate. I don't know. You guys have any thoughts about this before we go to the post game?
I want to know what job he was working, because I looked it up. He went to UMass, which is right down the street from me, and he was making enough to pay for what ended up being roughly $30,000 for tuition at UMass. So, like, what job was he working to pay $30,000 in tuition?
Expenses, right?
I'm sorry?
$30,000 for tuition, plus housing, plus food, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, you've been around here. Like it's not necessarily cheap around here.
No, it's not.
Yeah, I mean, I was looking at he had to be making
about being a security guard, but man, if that is what they're paying, if they're paying campus security guards, let's say everything else, housing, food, and everything else you can do for $10,000 a year. If they're paying security guards $40,000 a year for a schedule that's compatible with a full-time college load, then
or overload actually with him.
Overload, yeah, wow. Okay, everybody who's watching this is now going to apply for a job as a UMass campus security guard.
I don't know if we could all cut it. I think he's just intimidating. He's just the best security guard on campus. So
there we go.
Market allocation.
It's a hot shot security guard.
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I just the thing that seems, I guess the point I would just kind of circle in the line before we go to our very short post game tonight is that this whole thing about regressive that student loan debt is regressive because on average people who own student loan debt are higher income always just drives me crazy, because it's like, okay, but an average isn't everybody, and if your goal is to have people who earn more money pay more to the federal government and not pay less than they are right now, like we have I'm not making any radical Marxist point here, just like a really banal mainstream one. We do have a way of doing that.
Right.
Like if you want rich people to pay more money, right? Like you don't have to go through this proxy of, make them pay off student debt that they're more likely to have if they're higher income. It's like, no, you could just raise the taxes of high income earners.
Yeah, I have a question about when if something is considered regressive, like you're saying student, because what I actually don't know is for, let's say Biden had been I think Biden actually also has canceled some student debt, right? Even though
so if you did, his original student debt cancellation was through the HEROES Act, which I kind of referred to during the debate at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said that that the HEROES Act that he was using, that like he couldn't legitimately use that, which was actually they kind of had to like use this weird argumentative pretzel
Sure.
to make that work because the text of the law says that the president can either waive or amend certain, things like student debt repayment. And so they had to come up with this amazing argument that it wasn't like that just forgiving student loans for some people wasn't enough to count as waiving, but it was too much to count as amending. So it wasn't waiving or amending. But then I think after the Supreme Court decision, he went back and found an alternative mechanism. So right now they are still, unless the Supreme Court says the alternate mechanism doesn't work either, they are still going to be forgiving some student debt.
Okay, because just the one thing, and maybe this is longer than we have time for, although I guess we are a bit early, right? Is he's talking about a regressive tax, right? But when Biden cancels student loans, where does that money come from? Do you see what I'm saying? Like, is it, he's making it sound like it's actually coming from higher taxes from working class people, but it's not like Biden is also raising more revenue by, he didn't pass a law, or Congress didn't pass a law to then raise taxes on working class people to pay for the student debt. He's just not receiving the money, right? I mean, the federal government just isn't receiving the money from the debt. So I'm just saying, I feel like the economics here are pretty confusing on how it's regressive. Like, where's the money coming from? It's not like it's being replaced, right? Like they're just not getting it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm going to, and actually I think we're okay on time. As I was originally sort of conceiving this, we're going to do like a half main show and then, and then go to our post game. But I think we can just maybe do like a 2/3, 3/4 main show, and then maybe take a longer than usual break before our post game. But but yeah, I mean, this is what I was trying to hit him on at the beginning. That I think there is this weird inconsistency between the way that people like Brad will talk about canceling student debt as if this is a cash transfer to people, as if the government were sending a check to the people who now no longer owe student debt they would have owed. But they don't talk about tax cuts like that. Like they don't and it's the same principle, right? Because either way, you're saying, well, revenue that was going to be coming in isn't going to be coming in. And I know I saw this in the chat. Some leftists are really interested in modern monetary theory now, and people who are very MMT brain will say, actually, taxes don't pay for anything. I'm not quite sure I exactly buy that. I think some of this is semantics because even MMT people will say, well, you can pay for things, you can finance things by other methods than taxation up to a certain point, and then you hit inflation. And it's like, well, it sort of sounds like you're still saying that taxes, whatever. That's not it. In any case, I don't think that's a battle. I don't think that's a hill worth dying on. I'm perfectly happy to say that, even though it's not one-to-one or whatever, that like in a certain sense, taxes pay for things. But if you're going to say, less revenue coming in from a certain source is exactly the same as the government giving money to people from that source, then every time Republicans pass a tax cut for rich people, then that amounts to the government giving money to rich people. I don't think they would accept that. And yeah, you can pay for it in, to the extent that you say, well, you now have less revenue. And even if you've got some sort of balanced budget constraint, so you then have to either cut stuff or come up with more revenue, all of the choices are still available to you, right? You don't have to do that, do that. Like the most obvious thing, I mean, and before even talking about stuff like how I've been doing my mandatory Los Angeles leftist naturalization and reading Mike Davis, City of Quartz, and he's got some nice lines in there about like he'll sort of casually do in the middle of the sentence. It's like the all of the B-52s that are manufactured in this place in Southern California, each of them worth such and such tens of thousands of units of public housing. That similarly, right? Like, look, you could cancel a whole lot of student debt if you were willing to just have the United States pay for, have like a larger military than the next 9 largest militaries in the world combined, or the next 8 or whatever. But even assuming that there's like nothing you want to cut, and there's a little bit less revenue coming in because of that, okay, great. I mean, again, the obvious solution is just progressive taxation. Just have less money. Like, just, again, if the big concern is regressiveness, great. Like, just tax higher earners more. I mean, like, and maybe everybody a little bit more, but etc. Okay. I'm gonna cut the main show here for tonight. Last thing I want to say before I do is I want to just plug what we've got coming up next week. So and I want to plug it by mentioning something that I saw on Twitter. You guys probably saw this. The American Political Science Association, APSA, is supposed to have its conference at a hotel where the workers are on strike, and this has led to a lot of stuff. Like, well, for example, this person, Sarah Liu, her political scientist, Edinburgh research teach/tweet on #gender, #migration, #protests, #Asia, #higher education. Sounds like a pretty progressive person. And I saw her tweeting this and a lot of people reacting to it. The best I can do is not cross the physical picket line. I don't know if that means that she's going to like come in through the back door. Anyway, I'm unclear on that. Because I cannot face the financial consequences for not attending APSA. So I also want to be there for my PhD students who are footing their own bills for their overseas travel. So she was going to get stuff reimbursed, and she doesn't want to have to pay for it out of pocket. The stuff that she can't get canceled, that she won't get reimbursed, and taking any sort of financial hit for the sake of not strike breaking is too much. And anyway, she wants to be there for her PhD students, and she says in a follow-up tweet, "Those who are able to cancel, please be aware that it takes privilege to stand in complete solidarity with the workers." About which all I have to say is that next week's guest is Freddie DeBoer, who's going to be talking about his new book that's about to come out called How Elites Ate the Social Justice Movement. And I think that is more or less self-explanatory. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to take a little bit of a longer break than usual, but so I think we're actually, despite what it says in the email to patrons, I think we're going to start the post game at the usual time. We're just going to, take a longer break before it. So I will see you there. If you are not a patron and you want to become one, it's patreon.com/Ben Burgis, $5 a month, access to every patron exclusive post game after a regular Monday night episode, access to the Discord server, access to various bonus things. Most of all, our eternal love and gratitude for keeping this going. Left is best.